So, a talking point or a little rhetorical idea that you'll encounter from both far right wingers as well as a smattering of Republicans and libertarians is that colonialism, if not justified, was is understandable from a historical perspective because it fell within the purview of the established rules of war at the time, and fell within historical expectations. The idea that anyone would have done it had they the capabilities, and that kind of thing. And that is blatantly false. Colonialism is pretty inarguably one of the most brutal historical moments, so to speak, probably until the 20th century with the World Wars and the Cold War, taken as a collective conflict. And it had quite a few large departures from the previously established rules of war, or at least the rules of conquest. Um, European medieval conquest norms um, were generally pretty unobtrusive for the average person. Obviously, the process of the war itself, peasants could get their farms sacked and things like that, and artisans could get robbed by soldiers and that kind of thing. But in the post-conquest situation for people living in newly conquered land, they would not see too much change. Um, they would have a new lord, more than likely. Um, you generally don't want to have aristocracy from another country ruling your newly conquered territory. So, because of that, they could have for peasants, they could have to give more food to the lord. A merchant or an artisan could have to pay more taxes, that kind of thing. But that was all on an individual level, based on their local lords. Um, on a cultural level, generally speaking, cultures were left to be. Um, there isn't really a whole lot that medieval monarchs could do generally about cultures. Um, I suppose the exceptions would be in the early Middle Ages with um, the the Reconquista for one, I suppose, in Spain, but also the Germanic wars against the Holy Roman Wars against the pagan Germanic tribes. Um, that's probably closer to colonialism, I guess. Although, for one, it was on a much smaller scale, and they were um, a bit more neatly integrated, and they weren't quite so violently divorced from their culture. Um, Whereas, and even going before that to um, more ancient society or tribal rules of conquest and stuff, there was indeed a lot of slave taking, which is another of those right wing talking points. But obviously, by virtue of them being tribal, a huge majority of the time, they were necessarily on a very small scale, especially comparatively to the scale of colonialism. Uh, as well as that they didn't really result in the creation of racial hierarchies and stuff like that, which slavery in colonial times did in fact do. As well as the fact that there were lots of examples of ancient warfare and conquest that didn't result in anything like that, especially with the big ass empires of that time, like the Persians or Alexander the Great or the Egyptians. Also, generally pretty laissez-faire. That's pretty much the only way that anyone could run such a large area of land at that time was by being pretty chill and just leaving people alone for the most part. Colonialism, on the other hand, yeah, like I said, not exactly follow those trends. Um, the confiscation of land, um, probably one of the bigger differences. Native peoples, whether they were in the Americas or Africa or Asia, um, were the majority of the time. I guess this specifically is probably more of an America thing. They were either forced to migrate off of their land to make way for uh, white settlers, which is why I say more of an America thing, since that was a settler colonial state, or they were taken into captivity and were essentially the property of the conquering nation. And this was, like I said, the case in most of the colonized world, with the exception of a lot of the settler colonial states. Um, so yeah, this disappropriation of land was fairly unprecedented. Again, some tribal war caused some migration, but like I said, this is on a small scale. Usually, the migration was a fairly small distance compared to things like the Trail of Tears or whatever. And even then, sorry, it's really late. I forgot where I was going with that. I'm sorry, I'm kind of fucked up. Give me a sec. Yeah, I don't know. And the other big difference is the forced cultural destruction or conversion, however you would want to put it, that occurred amongst the newly enslaved, I guess is a strong word, but the newly conquered, the newly taken into bondage people. Again, obviously, this is really evident in the Americas, where the Europeans had several hundred years to divorce people from their culture and outlaw religious ceremonies and cultural celebrations, festivals, all that kind of stuff, and instead promote their own. Obviously, the forced spread of Christianity over that part of the world and a lot of other parts of the world is a big part of that. And yeah, like I said, with the with a few notable historical examples, that kind of thing was not super common. And even when they were common, the Reconquista and the subsequent Inquisition, not exactly historical moments looked on too favorably. So I don't see why these would get a pass. Um, so, yeah, hopefully. And that's not even to touch upon the horrible, horrible shit that happened outside of, just the treatment of them post conquering. To talk about all the crazy genocide that happened. Um, not even to get into the whole spread of disease thing among Native Americans, which is not not anywhere near so, whoopsie doodle, we accidentally killed tens of millions of Native Americans, as again right wingers would have you believe. Um, the yeah, the crazy genocide that took place, especially in a lot of places in Africa and Asia. Um, Not even touching all of that, just on the stuff I mentioned. Hopefully, I've made a convincing case um, as to why it's not good. Also, Jesus, not even to touch on the ways that it's economically fucked up. Um, you know, a lot of, or most of, I guess, colonized countries. That's probably another video unto itself that I could make, and I might make in the future. Who can say? Um, so yeah.